once again by jogging your memory and just briefly, we'll spend more than 2 minutes on this, going over the historical background and the authorship of the Torah, and then we're going to get into the text itself. We begin, I will refresh your memory, we should even go back a little bit further. The kingdom of David, best historical ballpark figure, right around the year 1000, David had a unified kingdom. He passed it on to his son Solomon, and when Solomon died, his kingdom was inherited by his son, and his son was really oppressive, heavy taxation and demanding a lot of labor and things like this from the Israelites, and so the northern kingdom rebelled and broke off. And this happens around the year 900, somewhere in there. And therefore, we have two kingdoms. Instead of one unified kingdom of David and Saul, we have two kingdoms. And this is where our story picks up then, the origins of the Torah. And I tried to stress in my notes and in my lecture last week that in order to understand the book of Exodus, you have to keep in mind that it's part of a larger work. That is, it's part of the Torah, the first 5 books of the Old Testament. And it was put together and edited, Exodus itself, strongly edited in order to fit into the overall narrative of the Torah itself. All right, well, in order to pick up the thread of the Torah, we have to understand a couple of things that happen. There is a huge disruption in the history of the Israelites in the year 722. The Assyrians, who are a major power at that point, come down and they completely destroy the northern kingdom. They exile, take in captivity most of the people. They plunder the area pretty badly, and they disperse them between the areas of the Tigris and the Euphrates River. And the reason that they didn't go down and do the same thing to Judah was because Judah at that time was a backwater. It really didn't offer the same payoff as plundering and taking over the northern kingdom. So we have then, at that point, we have one kingdom left, the kingdom of Judah, and the kingdom of Judah then survives down until around the year 587, when it is captured by the Babylonians. The Assyrians, that empire fractures and disappears. In the year 587, the Babylonians come down and they capture the kingdom of Judah. They take most of the learned people, all the scribes and the priests and the skilled artisans, they take them into exile to Babylonia in the Mesopotamian area. We have some rare footage of this event. You can see it right here taking place before your very eyes. The green is the destruction of the kingdom of Israel, and then this sort of lavender or purple follows the line of the Babylonian captivity. All right, so this is the historical flow that provides the background then for the creation of the Torah. One important thing to keep in mind is that in the year 538, the Babylonian Empire is destroyed by the Persian Empire, and the Persian Emperor, Cyrus the Great, this is actually in the Bible. It's really cool. You can read this. It's in the Bible. The Edict of Cyrus the Great says, I decree that all of the Hebrew people can go back to their lands. This occurs in the year 538. And so we get that learned cadre of priests and scribes and elders coming back after an absence of more than half a century, coming back over here to ruins. Right? Jerusalem has been destroyed. The Temple of Solomon has been ruined. And they have to put things back together. All right, so that is the historical background. People take whole semesters and 2 semesters to go through that and learn in places, and you got it in 3.5 minutes. Any questions? He asked with trepidation. No? Okay. Wow, I did that good of a job. All right, okay. All right. So that if that's a historical background, and just briefly then, and here's the massive, you can see the Persian Empire, and one of the things to keep in mind when, and they're called Jews now, right, because they come from Judah. They come from Judah, and so they start being called Jews instead of Israelites. When the Jews return to Judah back here, it's just part of this massive Persian Empire, and politically they are not independent. As a matter of fact, they're subjected to Persian rule. They don't even have a king. They don't have political rulers. It's the religious leaders, the Levites, the priests and the scribes who come back, who are trying then to reconstruct this society. They try to rebuild the temple, as a matter of fact, they do. And the Levites then play an oversized or outsized role in the history of Judaism when they come back after the Babylonian captivity in year 538. All right, so Where does the Torah come in? This is, again, just a brief thumbnail sketch. You remember from my remarks last week that the best that we can discern here in looking at the first 5 books of the Old Testament, there appear to be 4 different texts or 4 different authors. The oldest one that is a cohesive text is the book of Deuteronomy, composed in the time of King Josiah. This would be in Judah, in the southern kingdom, around the year 622 BCE. And again, there's evidence of this in the book of Kings, where it's described, they have discovered the Torah, the teachings of Moses, in the temple. And they take that to be the book of Deuteronomy. Older traditions and older oral stories existed before Deuteronomy, and they come to be called the Yahweh's text and the Elohist text. The Yahweh's text, the contents of this text was in circulation for centuries, from around the year 850 BCE in Judah. Finally, and this is the best historical, the best biblical scholars working today believe this, that this is finally, these stories are finally collected, edited, and written down during the Babylonian exile from 587 down to 538. Much of the first half of Exodus is from this source. Okay, secondly, the Elohist text. The contents of this text was in circulation for centuries, dating from 922 BCE in the northern kingdom of Israel, finally collected and written down during Babylonian exile, 587, 538. Some of this text comprises Exodus. There's a strong theory that that really the Elohist text never existed independently, that these traditions and stories from the northern kingdom were just simply incorporated into the Yahweh's text when the Yahweh's text was written down. But don't lose any sleep over that. And then finally, the priestly text. And this is really what we are going to focus on, because the priestly text, these are the scribes and these are the editors that finally put the Pentateuch into its, or the Torah into its final shape. Okay, and so these guys are really important because they have shaped what we have today. The priestly text written, these are, rather than being a standalone text, the theory is that they are working with the combined Yahweh's text and the Elohist text, and what they do is, during the period of the exile, or when they come back to Judah, they begin editing that text and they begin to update it to reflect conditions around them when they come back to Judah. The priestly text, written additions to the Yahwist and Elohist text, done either during the Babylonian exile or shortly after the return of the exiles to Judah. This period runs from 587 down to 450, right? So not only does it begin while they're in Babylonia, but actually when they come back to Judah as well. Many additions to the Yahwist and Elohist texts in Exodus, plus all of Exodus chapters 25 through 31 and 35 through 40. That part, when you get to Exodus, where it just becomes mind-numbingly boring, and they're talking about the priestly garments and the building of the tabernacle and stuff like this, this is the priestly text. The first half, which is a rip-roaring discussion of Moses' life and the plagues and things like this, these come from the Elohist and the Yahwist text, right? And so you can really tell the difference there between these authorships, okay? This is, what should I say, our best understanding of the text at this point, but more research may turn up fine-tuning of this. All right, so any questions over any of that so far? Yes, Mark?
I have a question. So are we to understand that the priests and the scribes and these people, while they were in exile, they were able to do all this wonderful stuff? And they weren't made slaves. They weren't just sitting around crying and weeping. They were actually doing historic things that made the Bible.
Some of them anyway.
So they were able to do all these things even while they were in exile.
Part of, if you stop and think about that, it makes sense.
That's really remarkable.
Well, if you have this group of people who have lost their homeland, who have lost everything that has any meaning to them at all, and are transported in captivity, how are they going to retain their identity? And how are they going to retain any hope that any of this is ever going to come to an end, right? And why is their belief in their God just simply not destroyed altogether? And some authors, some historians and biblical scholars would argue that the priestly text is meant to answer those questions right there, right? Let's see, we need to remind people what happen during the Exodus. We've been in this situation before, right? And Yahweh came through big time for us, and Yahweh may do the same thing again. If in fact we honor Yahweh and we worship Yahweh, we remember Him, and there's a strong emphasis on rituals and ceremonies in Exodus, right? We get the Passover feast, right? We get the dedication of the firstborn child. We get the feast of the leavened bread. All of these rituals and sacrifices are laid out in Exodus. And if you want to please Yahweh, then if you want Yahweh to hear your moaning and your cries like He did once before, then you need to adhere to these things. So it literally, from a cultural standpoint, it makes perfectly good sense. It really does. Yeah. That's not to say that there weren't a number of these Israelites during the captivity who faced hard labor. But if you have, and this happens in the ancient world all the time because literacy is not widespread. If you have some a group of people who are literate, you want to keep those people, and you're not going to have them out in the fields, right, working and plowing and things like that, or working in mines. You're going to have them in your royal court where they can actually transcribe things for you and write. So you treat them a little bit better. Yeah.
And where were these? It's written where?
Oh, well, okay, let's go back. Again, we can't.
I missed class.
Pinpoint this exactly, but probably most of the literate population themselves are probably going to wind up in Babylon itself, right? Because this is a royal court. That's where the Babylonian emperor is, actually. And so our best surmises are that they're located up here along the Euphrates River, this area. But of course, you're going to have others that are out just simply doing hard labor and working out in the fields and things like that as well.
It just occurred to me, so I want to ask you, was Daniel part of these people?
That's really interesting, yeah. The book of Daniel.
He was there, he was captive, and...
Yeah, well, again, we should have a class on Daniel, because Daniel also is a response to the exilic and the post-exilic period as well. Yeah, was Daniel really there, or is Daniel very much like the text of the Yahwist and the Elohist? Are there legends of Daniel, and are there stories of someone like this that actually gets written down at a later date? Right? So keep that in mind. Hold that question until we get to Daniel. Okay. All right. Everybody have the handout, because we're gonna move rather quickly right here. Okay. Purpose of the Torah. We've already talked about this, but let's just go through this once again, because it will help you to explain what is in Exodus. The purpose of the Torah, and I'm looking here on page 1, written during the purpose of the Torah in Exodus, in the period of exile or the post-exilic period. That is, when these people find themselves in Babylon and then after they come back. First of all, to help the Israelites cope with life under the control of the Persians. The once proud kingdom of Judah was now a province in the Persian Empire called Yehud. The Jews were under the control, domination of the Persians. The priestly writers tried to explain to the Jews how they, the chosen people of God, had become enslaved and were now under the control of the Persians. The priestly writers also attempted to explain to the Jews how they could once again gain their freedom by obeying Yahweh. There's an emphasis upon the rituals and the festivals of Yahweh, and an emphasis upon daily and monthly sacrifices in the rebuilt temple in Jerusalem, which were carried out by the priests. So there's some evidence, I think pretty clear evidence, that the priestly writer continues to write while they are back in Jerusalem as well, with all this emphasis. Because what you get towards the end of Exodus is a temple built out in the wilderness, right? This portable tabernacle. It's a huge thing. And all of the duties and all the obligations of the Levites are laid out in detail out there, what they're supposed to do. And this is a clear reflection of what's going on in the post-exilic period in Jerusalem itself. Okay. Secondly, to help solidify the authority and control of the priests and the Levites who have now returned to Judah. The Persians did not permit the Jews to have a king. Into this power vacuum stepped the Persians and the Levites. Much of their writing, especially the book of Genesis and Exodus, provide genealogy that allows them to trace their authority right back to Aaron and the days of the Exodus. And we're going to see that in the chapters we look at today. And then finally, to help the Jews gain some independence from the Persians were willing to allow the Jews some self-rule and independence if they could produce a suitable, acceptable law code by which they would live. The Torah, reworked by the priestly writers, provides just such a law code. This would further enhance the power of the priests and the Levites in the post-exilic period. All right, let's get a couple of basic questions out of the way. Was there an Exodus? Was there a Moses? Okay. Many contemporary biblical scholars, today, point out numerous problems with taking the account of Exodus at its face value. Was there an Exodus? Okay, in Exodus chapter 12, verse 37, the author gives the number of Israelite males leaving Egypt as 600,000 males, allowing for wives and children. This would give a total of around 2 million people. That's a huge number of people. Okay, now here's the problem. There is no archaeological evidence whatsoever for such a mass migration across the Arabian Peninsula in ancient times. We just simply don't have the evidence. You would think that there would be charred remains of bonfires, there would be campsites, there would be debris, something like this. There's nothing like that. There's nothing like that. Yeah.
But there is a historical story about Cyrus and about the people returning.
Oh, well, see, we're talking two different things.
So there must have been a beginning.
No, we're talking two different things. You're right that they returned from the Babylonian exile, but I'm talking about did they come out of Egypt as an exodus?
Sorry.
Yeah,
I'm getting mixed up.
Two different things altogether.
Yes.
You're right. We can't. No, that's historical fact. But we're talking now about the Exodus under Moses. So there's a problem, right? We've got 2 million people that don't leave a trace in the Arabian Peninsula. That's sketchy right there. Okay. Secondly, there is no archaeological evidence to support a violent overthrow of the existing Canaanite civilization as described in the book of Joshua. Remember Joshua at the Battle of Jericho? We have no evidence for that, right? And Joshua and the Israelites it's described how they took over 30 more Canaanite cities in the area when they came, and we have no evidence of a violent overthrow at that period. Okay, on the other hand, the earliest reference to a land and a people called Israel is found on an Egyptian stele, that is a monument, dating from the reign of King Ramses II around the year 1250. Right, this is solid evidence. A people and a land called Israel. We have documentation of this around the year 1250. This references Israelites living in villages and highlands in the highlands of Canaan. Right, that is in and away from the Mediterranean, back up in the hills. This same period, around 1250. Witnessed numerous Semitic people living in Egypt, either as captives or as free people. We have evidence of this in the Egyptian records. This is the age of the Egyptian Empire, when Egypt is controlling not only Egypt, they push way down into Nubia, and they push all the way up here, all the way they're controlling all of Palestine, this area up and through here, and they take mention then of the Israelites that are living in this area. Okay, so 1250 we have historical documentation of a people called Israel living in Palestine in this period. All right. This same period, I already mentioned that, witnessed numerous Semitic people living in Egypt, either as captives or as free people. So we have a land and people called Israel living right here, and we also have Semitic people that is very well could be Israelites living down here in Egypt at the same time. The story of the Exodus, as it appears in the Torah, may be based upon the journey of a group of Israelites from Egypt through the Sinai Desert, who eventually joined up with those Israelites living in the highlands of Canaan. There may be something to this, right? Something to this. On the level of 2 million people, no. No, that's completely implausible. Okay, this Exodus, if it did take place, would not have been large. Perhaps, as some speculate, it may have been the tribe of Levites, since they never held any land in either Israel or Judah. This is interesting, right? That you have the 12 sons of Jacob, that is Israel, and when the land is divided up, 11 of these tribes, 11 of these sons hold land, but the Levites never hold any land. Were they latecomers, right? After the land's already divided up, and so they didn't have any. This is really fascinating. We don't know for sure. This smaller Exodus, rather than just being, like a sizable number of people, like 5,000 or 6,000 people, or maybe even 10,000 people, maybe rather than just one Exodus, maybe it is a slow sort of continual flow of people from Egypt back to Canaan. We don't know. But it very well may have occurred, some sort of an Exodus, just not on the size that's being, the scale that's being described in the book of Exodus itself. Okay, I'm willing to take questions here, because this is, not what you're used to hearing. Yeah.
Quick question. Somewhere way back in I think I heard people saying it's possible the Canaanites are really Jews.
Okay, let's clear this up. Were the Canaanites Jews? No. Were they the forerunners of the Israelites? Right? Because there's a huge difference here between the Jews and, well, I mean, the Israelites become the Jews, but here you're further on down. There's clear evidence that the people who are some evidence that the people who eventually become the Israelites may have intermingled and settled with the Canaanites. And it gets really messy, but if you look at the names that are used for God in the Old Testament, in the book of Genesis, many of those names, not many, but a few of those names are in fact Canaanite names, right? Canaanite names for God. El Shaddai, for instance, it's a Canaanite name. Elohim is a Canaanite name for God as well. And so there's a close intermingling between these people right here. Now, one of the arguments, and it's a very persuasive argument, is how do these people differentiate themselves from the Canaanites? And that is, they begin to worship Yahweh. And they get a cultural identity from worshiping Yahweh. And the question is, where do they get this notion of Yahweh from? Where does this come from? Exodus answers that question. Exodus tells you Moses brought it to him, right? Mm-hmm. Moses brought it to him. Yeah, this is really interesting. And the question is, where does Moses get it? He gets it from the Sinai desert, right? He goes into the desert and finds Yahweh, and Yahweh announces himself there. Yeah. This is fascinating. It's absolutely fascinating, right? Yeah.
Deserts are not usually the sources of great civilizations.
No. But this takes nothing away from the history of the Israelites. I mean, everybody has an origin. Everybody has an origin, and it may be that Abraham, and this is a whole other class altogether, that Abraham settles in Palestine, intermingles with the Canaanites, and there's a mixture of Abrahamic blood and Canaanite blood there as well, and then they eventually once again get their clear identity from worshiping Yahweh. Yeah. Okay, here's the next question. Was there a Moses? Was there a Moses? Moses may well have been a leader of a small group of Israelites who traveled from Egypt to Canaan. He and his group would have been followers of Yahweh. It's quite clear that whoever Moses was, whoever this person was, if his name was Moses or not, this person brings the religion of Yahweh to those people living there in Canaan. All right. He and his group would have been followers of Yahweh. They brought the worship of Yahweh to those Israelites already settled in Canaan. It's interesting to note that many times in Genesis, among the patriarchs, God is referred to as El Shaddai. We already said this, right? Not Yahweh, but many times, particularly when God makes a covenant with Abraham, the name of God there is not Yahweh, it's El Shaddai. That's interesting. Yeah. Okay. When did the Exodus take place? We don't know. We don't know. There is some textual evidence in Exodus 1:11. It tells us that the ruling Pharaoh, who initially oppressed the Israelites, had them build the cities of Pithom and Ramesses. These two cities were built under either Pharaoh Seti the first or his son Ramses the second. This is historical fact. Okay, let's go and take a look at this. You can see them. They're up in the Delta area. This is Pithom right here, and there's Ramesses right there. Right, those two cities, and they're well documented. And this is what the text tells us, that the Pharaoh had the Egyptian or the Hebrew people build these two cities. This would date, if this is true, this would date the Exodus probably around the time of 1250 or so, perhaps under Ramses II. If his father, Seti the first, oppressed them and made them build these cities, we learn that the first Pharaoh who oppressed them died, and a new Pharaoh came into power, and at this point Moses goes back to Egypt. That would mean that the Pharaoh was Ramses II, but we don't know. We don't know that for sure. Okay. We cannot rely upon this dating due to the heavy editing of the text and reworking of the text by the priestly writers during this period. Did they add the name of these two cities, which would have been well known to them by that point? We just don't know. Based upon the references to the cities of Pithom and Ramses, commentators have traditionally argued that the Israelites were living in the northeast area, I should say, of the Nile River Delta in a region called Goshen. Here's the land of Goshen. You always wondered where the land of Goshen was? You thought it was in Indiana, didn't you? No, it's right. There's the land of Goshen right there. Okay. All right. However, there is no solid proof for this. We don't know. And as a matter of fact, Goshen is never, the name Goshen is never used in the book of Exodus. Right? That comes from someplace else. But they're just assuming, because this was called the land of Goshen, and that here are the two cities that the Israelites built, that this is where they were living, right up there in the Delta region. All right, and I should say that there's clear evidence of other Semitic people living up in this area as well. Okay, so it's not at all improbable this could happen. This is the thing. All of this is quite possible, except for the 2 million people. Right? All of this is quite possible. All of this is quite possible. Yeah. And you can understand why there would be legends and stories of this, right? Just passed on down from time to time. You all know where you came from, don't you, right? Think back to your grandparents and great-grandparents, right? But how exact are you? Man, do you really know where your great-grandparents were born? Do you know where they're buried? You know, think about that. But you know something about them, don't you, right? And so, these legends and traditions get held on to and they get passed on down. All right, any questions about that? Yes, Peter?
You may have addressed this earlier on. Where does the name Exodus come from? What language?
That's the Greek, right? It's the Pentateuch, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Because in Hebrew it's called Shemot. Yeah.
The X suggests it might be Latin.
No, it's Greek. It's Greek. The Hebrew's
Latin
called
may not even exist.
Shemot because it starts out with a list of names, and Shemot is these are the names, right? Exodus, that's how it starts out. Okay. Examination of the text. Okay, here we go. All ready for this. Chapter 1. The Israelites are flourishing in Egypt, and the new Pharaoh does not like this. The priestly source, here we have the introduction of a priestly source. The first thing that you read when you get to Exodus does what the priestly source always does, and it gives you a genealogy. Right? It gives you a genealogy. And it starts out, these are the names of the son of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob, each with his household. And then it gives you 11 of the names, and it tells you that, well, Joseph was already there, making 12 altogether. And they do this, right, because remember now they're putting the Torah together, and they do this because they want to link it to Exodus, which ends with the death of Joseph in Egypt, right? We've gotten Jacob and his sons all together in Egypt, and then the priestly writer, in order to tightly link Exodus to Genesis, starts out with, just to remind you, here's where we are, right? Here are the sons of Jacob. Here are the sons of Jacob, and remember that Joseph has already died, okay? All right. But, and this is the thing, because God promised that he was going to watch over these people, the Israelites were fruitful and prolific. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong so that the land was filled with them. So God is doing what he promised, and that is that he's going to make them fruitful and multiply. But Pharaoh, of course, does not like this. The Pharaoh, and again, we don't know if this is Seti the first or if it's Ramses, we don't know who it was. The Pharaoh, we are told, oppresses the Israelites. He made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and brick and in every kind of field labor. And he ordered then, with the Israelites flourishing, he orders the midwives to kill all newborn Israelite males. This is what he's going to do, sort of like the slaughtering of the innocents by Herod later on. All right, this sets the stage then for Moses. Okay, so the idea here is that all newborn males are to be drowned in the Nile River. However, Moses is going to be spared. We learn that Moses' father and mother are both Levites. This is interesting, right? Moses is a Levite. And one of the things we're trying to do here is to stress the importance of the Levites. Right? The Israelite tribe that will later on during the post-exilic period serve as priests for the temple in Jerusalem. Moses, and you all, I'm boring you because you all know this story, is placed by his mother into a reed basket in the Nile River. He is rescued by Pharaoh's daughter. We are told then in chapter 2, and as part of this life of Moses, that Moses